Well, welcome. I'm Myles Immerkar, the current CEO of the Canadian Angus Association, and it's a great pleasure to be able to sit here today with one of the Angus breed legends, John Willmott. Just reading some of John's history, he's been a pioneer, a builder, a breeder, a manager, a judge. I just learned that a few minutes ago. A variety, a board member, multiple occasions. I think this year is 50 years since John's first served. It's maybe a year or two out. But since John first served as his first peer on the board, also served 35 years ago, a role which I'm really interested in learning about when he became the GM of the Canadian Angus Association from 87 to 91. So I think a great opportunity today to learn a bit about the Canadian history from John Willmott himself. I'm going to start just a few brief questions there, John. And I want to go back to when you first took the role. In 1985, you were president of the board, and 2 years later took the role to take over general manager. Maybe just briefly introduce me to the Angus Association at that time, and what led to going from president role to a general manager role, and the state of the Angus Association at that time to make that decision under.
Well, at that time, the Angus were just starting to forge ahead from what they had been. They always were about fourth place in the number of registrations in Canada, things like that. And after the World Angus Forum, it seemed to, because the forum gave the breed quite a lift in Canada, I think. And I was fortunate enough to be president in 1985 when we hosted the Queen Mother and had the World Angus Forum in Edmonton. And then after that, of course, Resby Coots had been the general manager during the forum, but he wanted to retire and do other things. And of course, I was selected to be general manager in 1987, and I filled that role for a few years. And the Angus were just starting to really take off. And of course, we moved the office, which had been in Guelph, Ontario, for forever, it seemed like, and we moved it to Regina, to Everett's Place, Fairgrounds in Regina, and that was a very popular move at the time, and it was quite a shake-up for the Angus Association. Of course, we didn't have a lot of staff at that time, and of course the registrations were still done by Canadian National Livestock Records in Ottawa at that time. Shortly after that, it was changed and done in-house in the Angus Association headquarters themselves.
So, John, tell me a little bit about in 1987 when you first took the role as general manager of the Canadian Angus Association. And as you sat around the board table, what were some of the big challenges you saw from the association and the breed identity at that time that was challenging?
Well, it had just come through a period where Angus weren't as popular in the feedlots and so forth as some of the exotic breeds that had kind of taken over in the 70s and 80s. And of course, we had to get past that stigma at the time. And of course, we were trying to get EPD information more established, get breeders more educated on how to use those birth weights, weaning weights, and things such as that. And of course, our show program at the time wasn't nearly as popular as it has become since. And we started to work on getting the show bull of the year and show cow and so forth, to encourage people to get their animals out in front of the public. And it was kind of a marketing tool we were trying to use at the time. And of course, our membership was increasing. And of course, we felt that perhaps we could do a better job of registering our cattle if we did within-house. So that was quite a debate, because it was a tradition that Livestock Records in Ottawa had done it forever. And of course, some people were opposed to the fact that perhaps we could do it better ourselves. And of course, the internet and computers were starting to become more in vogue then. And of course, it was getting much easier to register animals using the computer and things like that than it had been in the past. So all those things were a change which had to be made. Plus, moving the office from Guelph to Regina was a big move at that time, and it seemed to be a very popular move with most people. And I think it got us in closer to the commercial market and things like that, and to commercial sales in Saskatchewan. And of course, we were starting to get feeder sales, Black Angus feeder sales started at that time, and Bob Prestige worked on that quite a bit, and things like that. So it's a time for getting renewed optimism in the breed.
So you brought up a great point there. You talked about a little bit of technology that you may be dealing with there, and it's things that we deal with today at the association. Very similar. EPD still is a topic hot on mind for a lot of breeders, and it's even advanced beyond that with other technologies such as genomics and other tools that we try to provide with our members to be able to evaluate their cattle as we look at any of the agriculture industries out there today, whether it's the dairy or the pork or the cropping industry. Technology has really kind of advanced those breeds there, and we're looking to do the same there. So when you sat around the board table in 1987 and you looked at some of the technology out there, what was maybe some of the vision of the board and the opportunities you saw, or how did you want to, with EPDs itself, educate your members and show that value of those tools for them?
Well, we wanted to be have a closer connection with the breeders, and we wanted to inform the breeders better than we had in the past. And of course, we'd always done that through our Angus magazines before, the Angus News way back when, and we tried to expand that so we could make our members more informed on all of the new things coming down the pike that might be done, along with the EPD business and things like that. And we did have some reluctance on some people's thinking, well, we don't need to do that, we just need to register the cattle. But a lot of the people believed that we needed to inform them better and to promote the breed better, and we hoped we would expand, which as it turned out we did, and it was very interesting. And of course, there's always around the board table, you get a certain percentage of people that are reluctant to change and do things like that, but in the long run it worked out well, and we were very pleased with the way it worked. And then eventually, of course, we moved the office to Calgary, which was a good move as well, I think, and it was hard for some people to accept the move to Alberta, but I think in the long run it was the best thing to do.
So you just spoke a little bit of communication there, and as I look where we are today as an association, communication still is one of our challenges there, and you think that over time that it should become easier. In today's world, we've got social media where you have Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat and probably a half dozen other ones that I don't even know about yet. Some of our members prefer communication by mail, and some want it by email, and some want different platforms, and it's actually become a greater challenge for us trying to find what platform we communicate with to our members. Back then, what was your kind of strategy with communication? What was the kind of the method of how you got to your members as quick as possible with information as quick as possible?
Well, on today's things, what we were doing back then was probably archaic in a sense, because most of it was done by mail, and then of course we did get so they could do it on the internet, registrations and things like that. But it was slow to develop, but I think it has come along. And of course, we have a lot of young, enthusiastic breeders now that are very well informed, and I think they're great for the breed. I think they're really going to bring the breed ahead now. And of course, the communication is changing daily. If you listen to the radio or television, everything's changing minute by minute. And I'm a little old-fashioned. I guess it's hard for me to accept some of these changes, but I'm sure that the new young breeders coming along, they're going to just love what's going on and the communication you're giving to the breeders, which is great. Probably the best it's ever been.
Great. So through the support of our foundation over the last few years, we've been able to invest in research, trying to look at new ways to advance the breed through new traits and new programs on that. Back in the late 80s, you were right at the time where Certified Angus, for example, was just probably 10 years into their launch, and EPDs were just being introduced. What other maybe discussions around that board table did the board at that time see as a visionary opportunity for investment and research that maybe you saw what we could have developed a little further with advanced Angus?
Well, I was quite familiar with the Certified Angus Beef program in the States. I knew the fellow that was managing it at the time, and of course it was very successful down there. We really hadn't got it going up here at that time. There was a little bit of it around, and you could go to a restaurant and have certified Angus beef on the menu, but it was slower going up here because our grading system was slightly different than the Americans, and so it wasn't quite so easy. Plus, in Canada, we have red Angus and black Angus, and of course, the people in the States, one of their criteria was it had to be black to be used in their certified Angus beef program. And of course, I know when they started, I was familiar with some of the directors on the American Angus Association Board of Directors, and it got to a point at the start that their director said, if this program doesn't take off in the next year, we're not going to invest any more money in it, you'll have to cancel it. And luckily, it took off when that ultimatum was laid down by the board of the American Angus Association. It took off from then on, but it was very close to being canceled, which would have been a terrible thing in retrospect. But I found that very interesting, the fact that they were putting a lot of money into the program and couldn't seem to see the results at the time. They said their bull sales weren't increasing and the cattle weren't bringing more money and so forth. But then finally it caught on and away it went. And of course now it's benefiting us up here as well. And it's a great program. And of course you go to all these restaurants now and there's Angus beef or Angus burgers or this and that. And it's great. And of course I'm glad in our country we're fortunate because we can use the red Angus and the black Angus both because they are the same thing anyway.
Yeah. So you have the luxury of, I believe you're the only board member ever to serve 2 different terms as president there, I believe 15 years apart. How do you compare your time on the board in 1970 versus 1985 and maybe the 2 different periods of challenges that the Angus breed was going through in those 2 different times?
Yes, it was quite different. Of course, the first time I was president, we had to hire a general manager. We didn't, the one had left, and we had to do that. And we didn't have an Angus magazine per se at that time, and we had to, I was fortunate enough to get Dick Turner at that time to look after the Angus news. So my first term as president, I spent most of my time either hiring a general manager or hiring a magazine person, and of course we sometimes had field men and sometimes we didn't, and sometimes they would last for a few months and then they get tired of it. We didn't really have a good work ethic for them, and of course so back then that's what I did most of the legwork on in 1969 I guess it was, but in 1985 of course we had a general manager at the time and things were moving much faster. And we had more going on with the certified Angus beef and things like that, and EPDs and registrations were going up. We were on the upswing, and so it was a fair bit different in 85 than it was back in 69, 70, my first term as president. But both times were interesting. The boards were similar, different people, of course, but similar board meetings. And back then, we didn't have many board meetings a year. We'd have an annual meeting in the winter, and we eventually decided that June was a better time than February when people were calving, and that took a little while to get changed around, things like that. But boards were similar, but different topics were discussed back in 85 than they were back in 69.
So how did your board operate or governor back in either year there, with obviously some of the communication tools available today are very much different? Just recently we did our board meeting through Zoom because we couldn't travel there. Obviously those technologies probably weren't available back then, or similar platforms there. And how did you communicate with your board members to keep everybody up to speed or get feedback? Because travel costs probably were not similar, as easy for us as we can do today.
Yeah, we basically, in those early days, we just had a convention, and in the winter we'd have a 3-day convention with 2 or 3 board meetings there, and then of course board meetings would be done by letter or phone calls and things like that. And of course there wasn't nearly as many activities to perform with, and things like that. And then when we got moved to Regina, we had more board meetings then, 2 or 3 a year back, 87, 88, 89, 90 there. And of course, we had more board meetings then, and travel was still relatively inexpensive.
Yeah.
And of course, there was more activity on the board back then.
Okay, so John, we're going to go back to 1985 and the World Ag Forum, which is obviously a monumental event in Canadian Angus history there, and maybe share some insight in terms of that event and how Edmonton came to the place to be, and some of the challenges of having the Queen, and some of the highlights, and really how that drove the Angus breed forward from that event forward.
Well, I think, as I said, Edmonton was chosen. I think they had an active committee in Alberta Angus Association that was going to plan the forum, and Edmonton had the facilities, and the timing of the year was right for everyone to come as well. The Queen Mother had accepted in July for attendance at the forum, and that we thought was a real feather in our cap, because having someone with that prestige there meant a lot, and I know it brought an awful lot of visitors to the forum. There was many, I'm not sure, but it must have been 15 countries represented at the forum, and there was a large delegation from the U.S., I remember, and of course we had a couple of sessions at the forum with all of the delegations as well, and those were quite productive. And of course, they talked about certified Angus beef and about pedigrees, and keeping the breed pure, and EPDs and stuff like that were just coming in, so not many decisions were made on those things. But the fact that the Queen Mother was the matron of the World Angus Association, and she had Angus cattle as well, that was very nice, very good thing for the forum. And of course, we got a lot of press and publicity because of the Queen Mother being there. And I think that did the breed a world of good at World Angus Forum and things like that. And I think that the forum itself accomplished quite a lot as far as getting the world organization kind of gathered together and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. So when we look back at, many experiences in history there, what would be a couple of your highlights there, whether it was your first time on the board, your second time on the board, or your role as a staff member, or even as a breeder there, as you look back, some of those memorable highlights that you really cherish of your...
Well, the first year I was on the Canadian board, I was representing Ontario, and I was kind of the junior member elected from Ontario. But the three senior members at the time, Alec Edwards, Malcolm Bailey, and Tom Jackson, and they were senior fellows, and of course they were well known. And of course, I was the new kid on the block, and we had to take the train from the Union Station in Toronto because the annual meeting was being held in Kamloops. And of course, back then we didn't fly much, and so we all took the train from the Union Station in Toronto to Kamloops, to the Canadian Angus annual meeting. And I think McGilvery in Alberta was president of the Angus Association at the time. But anyway, that was my education on how to be a Canadian director and things like that. I remember getting on the train, and I would be, I guess, 30 years old, perhaps something like that. Anyway, and Tom Jackson said, "John, carry the suitcase on for me." And I said, "Okay, but my goodness, it's heavy. Well, what kind of clothes are you taking?" And he said, "Just carry it on, never mind the clothes." And I thought, this is the most weighted suitcase I was ever carrying. But I took it on, but I finally found out it was full of whiskey and hard-boiled eggs. And that's what those guys were eating on the train all the way out there, whiskey and hard-boiled eggs. And I got initiated pretty well. I lived through it, but that was my first Canadian Angus annual meeting I was ever at. that was a real eye-opener for me. But in those days, that's the way they ran the meetings, and of course, they would always be fighting with the Alberta directors or the Saskatchewan directors, or we're trying to get this for Ontario or that for Ontario. And it was quite an experience. But anyway, I learned a lot from those fellows besides the whiskey and the eggs.
That's great. So what brought you into the Angus breed, or what attracted you to the Angus breed, that, first as a breeder and then also want to take a different role within the association and as a board member?
Well, my family in Ontario were shorthorn breeders, and so I was raised with shorthorns. My dad had sheep. In fact, he became president of the Canadian Sheep Breeders Association about 1957, I guess, there's that area. Anyway, I was showing a shorthorn steer at the Queen's Guineas at the Toronto Royal, and I met this wonderful girl who had a Black Angus. And of course, she got reserve champion, and I got 8th or 9th in class, something like that. Anyway, to make a long story short, I thought, gee, I got to start to date her, of course. And of course, I thought, if I got an Angus, perhaps it might impress her and her father. Her father was a famous Angus breeder. And so I bought an Angus cow. I went to Tom Henderson, Glenross Farms in Guelph. I was at the University of Guelph at the time, and asked him, could I buy a heifer, an Angus heifer? He says, sorry, I don't have any for sale right now. Why don't you go talk to Wes Ham at Fergus? He has a nice Angus herd. So I went up to Wes. I bought a cow and a calf for $300, and I steered the calf, and I took him to the Guineas the next year, and I got reserve. But anyway, that's how I got my Angus herd started, with that one cow and calf from Wes Ham. And of course, Wes was the ran the Angus News at the time, so he was an Angus breeder, and he was an Ontario board member, and he looked after the Angus News at the time. So that's how I got started in the Angus breed. And then, of course, Cameron McTaggart, consultant and sales manager of the Angus breed, very prominent Angus breed. He nominated me to be on the Ontario board the first time. Mm-hmm. I went to meetings in the Royal York Hotel in Toronto, I remember. And he said, we got to get some young people in the Angus breed. I'm nominating John Willmott. So that was my first year on the Ontario Angus board. And then I became president of the Ontario Angus in 1964, a year after Tom Jackson, Bill Jackson's dad.
Yeah.
And went from there.
Great. So when you look at, your time within the association and board members, what were the things that maybe you're most proud of today? A visionary idea that you, whether it was on the board, that you saw come to fruition and even exceed your expectations, that were a success for the Angus breed on that side of it?
Well, I think when we moved the office from Guelph to Regina, I thought that was a good move, mm-hmm. to get it out into the cattle country better.
Yeah.
Way back when it was Guelph, of course, there was a lot of cattle around Guelph at that time, but that kind of faded away and built up. So I think moving the office here was good, and then getting the pedigrees shifted from livestock records, I think, was a good move. We made it. It was a little bit hard at first. A lot of people were against it. Of course, that was a traditional thing. Livestock records, they were doing on them, but because all of the breeds at one time used to go through livestock records, and even the Holsteins and the dog people all had their pedigrees done in Ottawa.
Yeah.
And of course, we changed, we moved ahead on that. And then, of course, we did end up hiring the odd field men and promoting things. And then, of course, we got these Angus feeder sales going that I mentioned before. That really got things taken off. And of course, I remember I was on the Canadian Cattlemen Association at one time, and Chris Mills was the manager at that time. And he always used to kid me at the meetings. How are your little black Angus doing, John? Are they falling in the gopher holes yet? The thing was Angus for tiny thing, you see, supposedly. And of course, we changed that image around. And of course, you could drive through the country back in those days, and if you went across the line into the States, Montana, most of of the herds were black, but up here they were white, Simmental, white boots, all different colors up here. Everybody figured, well, how come not more blacks up here? Well, when the grading system got changed around and they got certified Angus beef, talked about things like that, it changed. And of course, nowadays you see an awful lot more black cattle and red cattle out there than before.
So you brought up a good point of history there in the late 80s there. The cattle changed quite drastically through that period there. A lot of the breeds went from, known to be smaller frame breeds to much larger size of it. When you look back on that now, from the board side, what were some of the discussions around that point? And was that in the right direction, or was it a concern for the board in terms of how the cattle changed that quickly at that time?
Was some talk that way. I mean, they used to rant and rave about if you had an 1,800-pound 2-year-old Angus bull, that's a good sized bull. Well, then of course it got to be 2,000, and it got to be 2,200, 24. So you could see how Angus as a breed have changed, and of course we had to compete with these other breeds. And of course we're going along with more than just the weight type thing. I mean, we've expanded it now, so we want birth weight small so we don't have calving problems, things like that, ease of calving. And of course the carcass, because of certified Angus beef, if we get better carcasses, we're going to have a better market for our product and things like that. And now with the EBDs and so forth, and even more things that you mentioned before that I'm not even familiar with, about ways to improve the breed through different testing mechanisms they have nowadays, and that's all great for moving ahead. And of course I don't know how far it's going to end up at or where it will end up in another 10 years, but I guess it sure looks like it's going in the right direction now.
So obviously earlier here today, before we started filming, I had an opportunity to learn a little bit more about your history and some of the background there. And this year would have been the 50th show for Canadian Western Agribition, which is just down the road from here, and certainly a great event, one of the monumental events in our industry here. And you brought up that you were the first Angus judge in 1971 of Agribition there. So I'd like to maybe go back to that and what were the cattle like that day, or some of the challenges in evaluating the cattle there, where you saw the strength of the Angus breed at that time?
Okay, it was. I was actually in October of 1971. Yes, 1971. I was plowing out in the field, and my dad came out and he says, "You're wanted on the phone." And I said, "Okay, well, who is it?" Some West Cook in Regina. And I said, "Okay." So I went in and I phoned in West Cook. He was secretary of the Saskatchewan Angus Association. He said, "We're having a new show this fall." This is October, and it'll be at the end of November, and we'd like you to come and judge the Angus at the show. And I said, "Oh, okay." And I remember I had to get an Air Canada ticket. It was $150 returned from Toronto to Regina. But anyway, that's a side story. And so I came out to judge this first show, and it was quite a primitive show at the time. Organization was not very good. But I remember going into the ring, at the Coliseum at exhibition grounds, and of course the cow-calf class. This was for the Hayes business of showing you could prize money through the federal government, and of course you could show a cow, but you had to have her calf with her, and of course there was 50 cows and 50 calves in the ring, and I can't remember who the ring man was helping me, but I said, and we did the whole ring, and I said, "I'm going to have trouble seeing." So I went around to every cow and calf, and I looked at them, and if they weren't very good, I said, "Thank you very much. I appreciate you bringing the cow and calf, and you can leave now." And so we kept doing that, and of course, eventually I got it down to about 20 where I could judge them properly.
Yeah.
And so that was quite a thing. But I remember some of the calves weren't clipped, some of the cows weren't, and some of the calves. There's humbugs in their noses, things like that. So it was a pretty primitive show, but it was very popular. Everybody in Saskatchewan must have come to it because it was quite a deal. And of course, that was the first show. And then, of course, I showed cattle at 1972 show. Brought cattle out from Ontario in my gooseneck trailer and everything. That was an experience in itself. And on the way back from that show, it was minus 30, and I was the young fellow that helped me. I had eight cattle and 2 calves, I think. Anyway, I was driving through northern Ontario, and I was getting tired. And I said to the young lad, I said, "You drive, but don't let the gas get below quarter full, because up in northern Ontario there isn't much in the way of gas stations." Okay. He woke me up in Long Lac, northern Ontario. He says, "We're getting out of gas." I said, "Oh gosh, why did you do that?" And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And I said, "Well, everything's closed. I can't even get gas." And he said, and then I saw Ontario Provincial Police Station there. So we pull up there, and I said, "We can't go any further. And then, would you like to come in?" And I said, "Yeah, we're kind of tired." "Well, you can sleep on the floor in the cell there if you like." So we got our mattresses and we slept on the floor. And in the morning we got gas. We headed back for home and we made it. So that was an experience, but that was 1972. Then in 1973, in August, we moved to Saskatchewan. And of course they had asked for me to be the judge in 73. In 72, Don Curry was the judge. And so I judged 1973. So that's the way that took place. But the cattle, of course, steadily improved. The more of them got clipped, then we started having cattle coming from Ontario and from the States, and then more from Alberta and British Columbia. And of course, it developed into a world-class show, which it is today. And that's kind of the history at the start.
Oh, great. Great, sir.
Yes, but I was asked in 74, I believe it was, to judge the Charlet at Agribition. And they had a tremendously large show. I'm not sure how many at the time. And I remember there was a Charlet cow, and she had twin calves. And she was wonderful. And so I made her grand champion. And of course, she was in the Charlet sale, and she sold for $100,000. And I never forgot that. And of course, judged many Angus shows and things like that. In fact, the first year I judged Agribition, Ralph, somebody from Lloydminster, he had 2 bull calves, and he took them down to the Toronto Royal, because in those days the provincial government paid a subsidy to take your cattle to the Toronto Royal. And he took 2 bull calves to the Toronto Royal, and they placed 4th and 5th in class down there, and he was so mad because one of his calves was pretty good, and he couldn't figure out why he was 4th and 5th in class at the Toronto Royal. Anyway, he decided he was going to show at Agribition in 1973. And of course, I was the judge in 1973, and I made the bull calf grand champion at Agribition. Same calf. So that was, I really liked the calf, and he was that good. And Ralph Griffith was the breeder's name. And that was kind of a highlight for me, because things like that. I took a judging course put on by the American Angus down there, and they had 85 or 90 candidates taking this course, and then they ranked them at the end, and I placed 4th out of 85. I'm pretty proud about that too. But that's with all Americans too.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I want to thank you, John. Thank you for a little bit of your history and a history lesson for me. As I always is saying, as we push forward as a breed and association, we can't really push forward until we know where we came from. And stories like that, I think, will really help shape, our strategies go forward. Allow us to evaluate things properly. But like I say, it's an important part of our history. It's an important part of our breed, and the opportunity for you to share some of those great stories with us here today, I think, will be of tremendous value to our members and our staff and our board members that we have today.
I enjoyed my time on the Canadian Angus boards, and I hope I did some good and served as well as I could.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. I love the breed. It's a wonderful breed. I love the people in it. And, as I get older, of course, it's moving on. That's the way I like to see it go, and everything is new. And I'm really impressed with the junior program that the Canadian Angus have now. I think it's great, wonderful thing. And you've been able to raise money to promote that breed. That was one thing we didn't do as well as the present board and people are doing nowadays. So
Yeah, no,
it's great.
It's definitely a big part of our future, and continue to keep our young generation in for the future there. And hopefully, we'll see you at a lot of future Angus events in the future. And I look forward to even getting more stories as they come back to you there. So, thank you.